The sky was clear when Luciana and Rafael first set foot on the white sands of Praia dos Carneiros. The low tide had formed natural pools along the coast, and a light breeze carried the scent of the sea mingled with that of freshly applied sunscreen on a nearby tourist. They walked hand in hand, their bare feet sinking slowly into the warm sand. There was no rush. For the first time in years, there were no appointments, no work commitments. It was just the two of them and time, finally free. Luciana had retired from the Lavras public school just a few months earlier. A Portuguese teacher for nearly 3 decades, she had always dreamed of a trip to the northeastern coast. Rafael, a former telephone technician, had left his job with an informal early retirement agreement. They sold their old car and used part of the money for this trip. They wanted a simple experience far from all-inclusive packages and sprawling resorts. When Rafael's friend sent photos of Praia dos Carneiros, they didn't hesitate. That would be their destination. They arrived at the small guest house late in the afternoon on January 7th, 2003. The place was modest but clean and quiet, with only 5 rooms and a veranda with hammocks facing the sea. The couple was greeted by Dona Arlene, a short, smiling woman who immediately offered them fresh cashew juice and pointed out the best time to walk to the sandbar. "Only after 4 in the afternoon," she advised, "when the tide starts to go out. Before that, it's all water." For the next 2 days, Rafael and Luciana calmly explored the surroundings. They ate fish stew at a rustic bar, sat in the shade of coconut trees for hours, and took dozens of photos with the digital camera Rafael had bought especially for the trip. At night, they wrote together in a notebook Luciana had brought, recording small observations. The taste of umbu juice, the sound of cicadas at dusk, the smell of firewood from a distant house. On the morning of the 10th, the couple decided to walk to a more deserted stretch of the beach. They carried a yellow backpack with 2 bottles of frozen water, sunscreen, a beach wrap, and some cookies. Luciana wore a navy blue bikini, and Rafael a pair of light blue shorts with white Crocs. On their way out of the guest house, they even smiled for a German tourist who asked to take their picture. The image shows them embracing, the sea in the background with a few other bathers in the distance. Beside them rests the yellow backpack and a striped towel. It was the last time they were seen alive. That day, the sun beat down hard until about 3 in the afternoon. Then thin clouds covered the sky, making the walk more pleasant. A fisherman returning from the tide later recounted seeing a couple walking along the shore heading to where there are no more houses, only brush. He found it strange but suspected nothing. There were no screams, no signs of a struggle. Just 2 tourists walking calmly like so many others. When night fell and Luciana and Rafael did not return, no one was alarmed. The guest house was used to guests who spent the day out, but when breakfast was served the next day and the couple still hadn't returned, Donna Arlene grew concerned. She knocked on their door. Everything was exactly as they had left it. The clothes were folded, the digital camera on the dresser, their documents tucked away in a carry-on bag. The weather turned around 9 in the morning on the 11th. A light rain began to fall, staining the sand and forming small puddles on the guest house's packed earth floor. An employee walked the beach to the sandbar, shouting Rafael's name. Another went to the dirt road that led to the nearest village. No one had seen them. At 5 in the afternoon, the guest house owner called the local police. In the following days, the search consumed the small community. Fishermen lent their boats, residents organized vigils. Police helicopters flew over the coastline. Divers scoured the reefs, but nothing was found. Not a trace, not an object, not a single footprint beyond the blurred marks of the hundreds of others who passed by there every day. The photograph taken by the German tourist was printed and posted on poles throughout the region. The image showed a happy couple, tanned, smiling, embracing. It was hard to imagine that just a few hours later they would vanish completely. The news spread quickly through the village. On the third day of the search, residents began going door to door with makeshift flyers. The image of the smiling couple taken by the tourist now looked like an old portrait of something that no longer existed. Praia dos Carneiros, still far from mass tourism, was overcome by an uncomfortable silence. The few beachfront businesses opened at a slower pace. Some residents said in hushed tones that nothing like this had ever happened there. To vanish like that, without even leaving a flip-flop behind, was something out of a movie. Luciana and Rafael seemed to have evaporated. For 9 days, volunteers took turns in the search. The police, who initially treated the case as a possible drowning, soon realized there were no strong currents in that stretch of the beach at that time of year. No body appeared, no object floated to the surface. The fishermen, people accustomed to reading the sea's signs, assured that if something had happened in the water it would have left a trace. The guest house where the couple had stayed became a meeting point. Dona Arlene received journalists from Recife, relatives who came from Lavras, investigators, and the curious. The carry-on bag with their documents remained untouched. The digital camera, forgotten on the dresser, was analyzed. The last photos were from the 10th, Rafael smiling with a green coconut in his hand, Luciana looking out at the sea, the two of them lying in the shade of a coconut tree. After that, only silence. At the small police station in the neighboring town, the paperwork piled up. There were no signs of a crime, but there were also no signs of an accident. It was as if the beach had swallowed them whole. Rafael had a daughter from a previous marriage who traveled to Pernambuco with Luciana's younger brother. They insisted on continuing the search on their own, but soon ran into the same barriers, a lack of clues, bureaucracy, and the inevitable exhaustion of hope when nothing happens. They returned to Minas Gerais after 2 weeks, carrying only the clothes left at the guest house and the camera with the photos from their last day. The case was archived the following year as an unexplained disappearance, a cold, impersonal term that came to define the family's lives. In Lavras, the story was still talked about in 2005, 2006. Then it began to fade. Time swallows even what seems unforgettable. And perhaps that is why telling this story today is so important. Why was there never a clear answer? And why do cases like this still happen on beaches, roads, and in small and large cities across Brazil? If you follow real stories like this and believe they deserve to be heard to the end, subscribe to the channel now. Your presence here helps keep alive the memory of people who one day disappeared without an explanation. This story is far from over. In 2014, exactly 11 years after that summer, something buried beneath the dunes of Praia dos Carneiros would change everything. It took 11 whole years before anyone would speak seriously again about the disappearance of Luciana and Rafael at Praia dos Carneiros. 11 summers passed. 11 seasons of tourists, colorful umbrellas, and photos on social media. While a story swallowed by the sand remained without an end. In Lavras, the families had learned to live with the absence. Rafael's daughter got married. She had children. Luciana's brother retired, but no one forgot, and no one accepted. The memory hovered like a ghost over birthdays, Christmases, and conversations about the past. Rafael and Luciana were still spoken of in the present tense. If they were here, someone would say, they loved the beach so much. The absence blended into daily life. Time, which should have healed, only covered the wound with more time. A layer of dust over something that continued to ache. By August 2014, Praia dos Carneiros was no longer the same. New restaurants had appeared, guest houses had multiplied, and tour buses arrived on weekends with entire families. Seo Chico, a 62-year-old local merchant, looked at it all with a certain nostalgia. He had been selling drinks, handmade hammocks, and straw chairs for decades. He was one of those old residents who could tell stories of when electricity was rationed and cars got stuck on the dirt road. He used to take an early walk before opening his shop. He always took Zico, his mixed-breed dog, who followed his steps in silence, occasionally darting after a crab. On August 14th, shortly after 6 a.m., Seo Chico followed a path between the dunes. The sky was clear, the sun still low. The early morning tide had left fresh marks on the sand, and the low-lying vegetation, damp with dew, glistened in the golden light. Zico was off-leash, sniffing everything with the agitated curiosity of a dog who knows every scent of the place. It was he who stopped suddenly. He began to dig frantically in an area where sand had collected in a hollow between two bushes. Seo Chico approached slowly. At first, he thought it might be an armadillo or something buried by tourists. But when he saw the outlines of something rigid and elongated, his chest tightened. The sack was long, grimy, with the texture of old canvas. The sides were tied with thick ropes, and over them, rusted chains formed a tense zigzag pattern. At the ends, two partially buried iron rings completed the structure. There was no smell, no blood, just that strange bulk hidden under nearly a foot of sand. But it wasn't the sack that truly made Seo Chico recoil. It was what lay beside it. A pair of white Crocs caked with sand, half sunk, turned on their side, as if they had been taken off in a hurry and left there. For a moment he didn't understand. Then his memory pulled up an old image seen on a notice board in the village years ago. A tourist couple. The man in light blue shorts, Crocs on his feet. The forgotten detail returned like a slap in the face. A chill ran through Seo Chico's entire body. He grabbed Zico by the collar and walked quickly back home. From there, he called the police. He didn't want to touch anything. "There's something wrong here," he repeated, his hand trembling. That same day, the area was cordoned off. The scene looked like something out of a movie. Photographers, forensic experts, investigators. The sack was carefully removed, placed in a pickup truck and taken for analysis at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Recife. The Crocs, photographed in detail, were taken with it. The image of the discovery spread quickly. Local blogs published the story with sensational headlines. The relatives in Minas Gerais found out even before the official confirmation. For the first time in over a decade, the case had resurfaced, not just literally. The lead investigator, Carlos Brandão, confirmed that the finding was relevant and consistent with past cases without giving many details. But sources close to the forensic team said that inside the sack were human remains in an advanced state of decomposition and possibly personal items. The speculation began anew. Was it the couple? Was it just Rafael? Where was Luciana? Or was it all a coincidence? Praia dos Carneiros, so vibrant in the summer months, was overcome by an unsettling silence that August. The place where beauty and tragedy had crossed paths was, once again, under everyone's watch. At the police station in Tamandaré, the municipality to which Praia dos Carneiros belongs, the phone rang incessantly. The discovery of the chain-bound sack generated a commotion no one had expected. Reporters began to circulate through the town. A drone flew over the dune area. Cars with license plates from Recife, Caruaru, and even Maceió parked near the main beach entrance, where the curious tried to get closer to the area cordoned off with yellow tape. But no one was allowed to get too close. The order was clear: preserve as much as possible any trace of what had been found. The scene was delicate. The fine sand, disturbed by the dog, could have covered precious clues. Around the hole, experts catalogued footprints, chain marks, wind direction, and the distance between the objects. Every centimeter was photographed. A police officer touched one of the sack's iron handles and noticed that it still turned, as if the object had been buried in a hurry or with clumsy movements. Meanwhile, silence reigned at Sio Chico's house. Sitting in a straw chair with Zico lying at his feet, he watched the street with a distant gaze. Although he was respected in the village, he knew his life would now be divided into a before and an after. That discovery, made almost by chance, had shattered what was left of the local peace. "I was just walking the dog like I always do," he would repeat whenever someone came to ask for details. But people wanted more. They wanted to know the feeling, the reaction. He couldn't say. He just remembered seeing the pair of Crocs and feeling a shiver start at the soles of his feet. Zico, now famous, barked whenever someone approached the gate. Perhaps he knew he had sniffed out something bigger than others understood. At the IML in Recife, the examinations took weeks. The remains found in the sack were in an advanced state of decomposition, almost reduced to bone fragments. Without a thorough examination, it was impossible to determine the exact number of individuals present. The forensics team worked with the hypothesis that at least one complete body was there, perhaps two, but time and the relentless action of the sand hindered everything. Meanwhile, the objects found beside the sack, including the white Crocs and a small plastic zipper pull, were sent for separate analysis. The first step was to confirm if the shoes truly belonged to Rafael. An enlarged photograph taken in 2003 was used as a comparative baseline. Although the sandals were worn, one detail caught their attention: a lateral groove on the right side, visible in the old image and present on the recovered pair. It wasn't definitive proof, but combined with the context, it felt like a strong link. The family in Lavras was contacted. Rafael's daughter traveled to Pernambuco with an uncle. They were received in secret, far from the press. At the morgue, they provided DNA samples to be compared with the recovered bones. Luciana had no children, but her brother also contributed genetic material. The forensics team promised no deadline. Once again, their grief would be measured in weeks of waiting. Meanwhile, the case was officially reopened. Detective Carlos Brandão, experienced and discreet, avoided interviews. Internally, the primary line of investigation shifted to homicide with the concealment of a body. The detective requested access to the old depositions from 2003, re-examined maps of the area, flew over the stretch of dunes in a helicopter, and authorized a new sweep with sniffer dogs, hoping to find something more than just the seat. The question that lingered was, why that location? Why bury them there, in an area that was relatively accessible yet just remote enough to go unnoticed for a decade? Who would have done this, and when? Was it right after the disappearance, or years later, taking advantage of the region's lax surveillance? There was also a disconcerting detail. The sack was buried at an incomplete depth. It was well covered, yes, but not as deep as one would expect to hide something permanently. Part of the chains had even become exposed and had only gone unnoticed because of the shifting dunes, which changed with the wind. Experts suggested the perpetrator might have been interrupted or perhaps intended to return later to finish the job. None of this brought any relief to the families. Rafael's daughter chose not to give any interviews. In Lavras, news of the possible discovery divided opinions. Some close friends saw it as the beginning of closure. Others felt it would only bring more pain. A neighbor who had lived next to the couple for over 20 years commented, "They were too good for an end like this. Always together, always so quiet. They never bothered anyone. This wasn't an accident. This was someone." Her words echoed in the corridors of the investigation. The possibility of a silent, meticulously concealed crime was gaining strength. But the absence of concrete leads prevented any real progress. No witnesses, no cameras, no confessions. The only certainty was that, buried in that sand, lay something that no longer wished to be hidden. The days following the reopening of the case brought a wave of speculation. National television programs began to cover the disappearance of the couple, featuring old interviews, archival footage, and dramatic reenactments. The photo of the couple smiling on the beach was displayed on LED screens. Headline after headline, a symbol of tranquility cut short. The image of the sack found in the dunes, though blurred, also circulated on social media. The white Crocs positioned beside it became an almost macabre signature. Brazil now remembered the case as the disappeared of Carneiros Beach. But the more people talked about what was, the less they knew about who and why. Detective Brandão remained silent. He reviewed depositions recorded in 2003, cross-referencing the accounts given by guesthouse employees, local fishermen, merchants, and tourists who had been staying there at the time. He searched for any contradiction, any point overlooked back then. One name, however, stood out among the forgotten documents. João Carlos Neves, a native of São Paulo, had been a guest at the same guesthouse as Rafael and Luciana between January 6th and 11th, 2003. At the time, he had stated that he barely spoke to the couple and had spent most of his time fishing in areas further north along the beach. He was a civil engineer, 38 at the time, and had checked in alone. His file showed that he had left the guesthouse on the morning of the 11th, even before the police were officially notified, that is, before the disappearance was formally reported. The temporal coincidence wasn't enough for an accusation, but it was enough to reopen a blind spot in the initial investigation. Brandão's team tried to locate him in São Paulo. They discovered he had moved years later to the interior of the state. He was married, had 2 children, and seemed to be living an absolutely ordinary life. He was called in for a new confidential deposition. He appeared a few days later, calm, saying he had little to add. He reiterated that he had only seen the couple at breakfast and that on the morning of the 10th, he had gone out. When he returned in the late afternoon, he didn't see them again. Asked why he had left the next day before his scheduled departure, he said he had felt unwell and preferred to return home early. The explanation was not entirely convincing, but without concrete proof, the police could go no further. Meanwhile, the DNA analysis continued. The delay was justified by the need to reconstruct bone fragments that were severely deteriorated. The heat, humidity, and contact with salty sand over the years had profoundly altered the composition of the materials. Even so, the experts remained cautiously optimistic. There was a high probability that the remains were compatible with the genetic profiles of Rafael's family. The impatient press began demanding conclusions that forensics had not yet validated. On a weekly crime show, a reporter declared live on air, "It's already clear that this is the couple, but someone is hiding it." The detective was pressured to give an interview, but he refused. In parallel, Luciana and Rafael's pasts were scrutinized, not because there was anything incriminating, but because the absence of concrete information created a vacuum for insinuation. One news portal even published that Rafael had old disagreements with a former business partner, a claim that was denied by his daughter and friends. Luciana, an admired teacher, had no history of conflict. In an attempt to help, the family authorized the release of a passage from the travel journal the couple had been keeping. In it, the last legible entry, written on January 9th, read, "Today the sky turned pink at dusk. We sat on the sandbar and just listened to the sea. Rafael said that if he had to choose a place to stop time, it would be here." The sentence was reproduced in numerous reports. Its poetic and serene tone contrasted violently with the case's developments, and perhaps that is why it touched so many people. After all, who would bury two strangers in a sack with chains? Who would have the strength, time, and motivation for such an act, and the silence to escape without a trace? With the renewed attention, tourists began to visit the dunes. Informal guides charged small fees to show them the spot where the sack was found. The beach, once a synonym for tranquility, now had an unsettling aura. Some residents asked the city to close off the area out of respect for the families. But none of this could dispel the central questions. How did two healthy, conscious adults disappear on a clear summer afternoon? Why did nothing turn up? And if the discovered sack truly brought an end to that mystery, why did it still feel like there was so much left to explain? Raphael's daughter, in a rare public statement, said, "We need to know, even if it takes another 11 years. What we can't do is pretend the sea took them and that's it. This wasn't the sea, someone took them." Carneiros Beach, accustomed to the slow rhythm of tourists, was different. Not just because of the influx of the curious, but because of the way the locals now looked at each other, as if any face could be connected to what happened 11 years prior. In the village, bars and grocery stores buzzed with talk of the case over sips of coffee. Fishermen recalled old conversations, trying to dredge their memories for anything they might have seen, something that seemed insignificant at the time. Detective Brando continued to work in silence. His small team was divided between analyzing physical evidence and revisiting old files. A detail that had seemed irrelevant at first resurfaced. A 2003 report of a small boat seen navigating slowly near the coast on the night of the disappearance. It wasn't clear who was on board. There was no registration number noted, just the account of a fisherman who said he found it strange for the boat to be out there, outside of normal fishing hours. Brando ordered this lead to be reevaluated. Locating a boat over a decade later was unlikely. But if cross-referenced with other data, it could point the way. He wondered, for example, if it was possible the couple had been taken far from the beach and not killed there. That could explain the lack of witnesses and immediate signs. But in that scenario, how would the remains have returned to the dunes? The forensic analysis of the bones in the sack progressed slowly. Forensic anthropologists confirmed there were bones from at least 2 adults. The genetic compatibility with Raphael's family was already considered high, though there was no official announcement. As for Luciana, the genetic material was insufficient for a definitive conclusion. The most accepted hypothesis internally was that both were there, but time and conditions had prevented total confirmation. However, a new element emerged. Among the remains were fragments of fabric with stitching characteristic of a women's bikini, dyed a faded blue. Experts photographed them and compared them with images from the last known photo of Luciana, where she was wearing a navy blue bikini. The resemblance was not legal proof, but for those following the case, it seemed like one more link in the chain. Meanwhile, life at the guest house where the couple had stayed in 2003 went on. Now managed by the original owner's son, the place had been renovated, but it still kept the veranda with its hammocks, a silent witness to a story that refused to be buried. Room 3, where Raphael and Luciana had slept, was still being rented out. Some guests, upon hearing the story, would ask to be moved. For some, it was a matter of macabre curiosity, for others, a genuine unease. Brando also requested interviews with former guests from that period. A few, now living in other states, agreed to speak. One woman from Belo Horizonte recalled seeing Luciana and Rafael walking north, carrying the yellow backpack. Having hiked the same trail the day before, she had warned the couple that the path grew desolate, with few points of return. Luciana had simply smiled, assuring her they would be back before dark. Another testimony came from a young man who, at the time, worked at a makeshift kiosk further down the beach. He claimed to have seen two people walking in the same direction from a distance but couldn't identify if they were the couple. The detail was that, according to him, a third individual was trailing them by a few meters as if they had just met on the path. The description of this third person was vague: a light-skinned man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dark shorts. No photographic or video evidence corroborated this. The suspicion that this was no accidental disappearance grew stronger. The detective, however, knew that every new piece of information also increased the risk of false leads. And time, once again, was a relentless adversary. 11 years of wind, tide, and sun had not only erased physical tracks, but had also scrambled memories. Rafael's daughter had returned to Minas Gerais after providing her DNA sample, but she remained in constant contact with Brandão. In a call recorded by the family themselves, she said, "I don't want this to be just another case that gets lost among the others. My father is not a statistic. My stepmother isn't either. They had a life and someone decided to rip that away from them." The detective, though accustomed to dealing with unsolved crimes, felt the weight of that sentence. The difference was that this time, there was something physical. Remains, objects, a location that could be thoroughly explored, a place that could tell a story suffocated by the silence of 2003. Still, there was no guarantee this story would ever reach its conclusion. The sands of Carneiros Beach had kept secrets for more than a decade, and perhaps they continued to guard others, invisible to the eye but alive in the memory of those who once walked there. The wind that blew from the dunes towards the sea carried fine grains of sand that seeped into everything: the clothes, the forensic team's equipment, the officers' shoes. With each new visit to the discovery site, it seemed the scene had subtly changed, as if nature itself wanted to erase what had been exposed. Brandão knew he couldn't rely on the physical space alone. He needed to mentally reconstruct what happened on that January afternoon in 2003. He met with two of the region's oldest fishermen. One of them, known as Old Beto, remembered a specific detail. On that day, the sea was calm, but the current was pulling south. "Strange," he said, "because the couple went north. If they had fallen in, they would have floated in the opposite direction." The second fisherman, Zé Lino, said he saw a small boat anchored near the reefs without any nets cast, which made no sense for fishing. The similarity to the old report of an unknown boat reignited that lead. The team revisited aerial images of the coastline taken in 2003 for an environmental project. The material was low resolution, but in one photo, taken on the 10th, shortly before 4 p.m., a single dark spot was visible near the deserted stretch of sand. It was impossible to confirm if it was a boat, a shadow, or just a natural formation. Still, the temporal coincidence was intriguing. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's office released a partial update. The DNA exam confirmed the presence of genetic material compatible with Rafael in the remains. As for Luciana, the sample was still inconclusive, but a separate report indicated that one of the bone fragments was from an adult female with an estimated height close to hers. This increased the probability that they were both in the same location. This confirmation brought opposing reactions from the family. There was relief and pain in equal measure. Knowing that Rafael was there ended an 11-year wait, but it also solidified the certainty that he had been murdered. It wasn't an accident, nor did he run away. And if he was in the bag, someone had put him there. This moved the mystery firmly into the realm of a crime. Faced with this, Brandão requested reinforcements for his team. He wanted to reconstruct the couple's last walk, step by step from the inn. They took time measurements, considering the average walking speed and the tide conditions on that day. The estimate was that Rafael and Luciana would have reached the remote stretch of dunes in about 40 minutes. This meant that to be surprised there, someone would have had to be heading in the same direction or already lying in wait. This idea connected with the testimony from the kiosk worker who mentioned the third man. If this figure was real, he could be the key. But after so many years, identifying someone with such a vague description was nearly impossible. In parallel, an off-the-record tip emerged. A former employee of a nearby inn mentioned informally that in the days following the disappearance, he saw two men carrying a large bundle wrapped in a tarp to a car parked behind a shed. He couldn't say if it was related, but the size and shape resembled something that could contain a body. The information was not in the 2003 files, indicating it had never been officially reported. Brando knew this kind of late-stage lead was dangerous. Human memory is fragile and prone to distortion. But he also knew that in cold cases, any thread could lead to another. He requested formal interviews and a cross-check of names of employees and guests from all the inns in the region during that week in January. Meanwhile, the dunes were once again a constant topic of conversation. Some residents complained about the increase in visitors drawn by the case. There were those selling mystery tours, guiding tourists to the discovery site. Others were irritated, calling it disrespectful. The mood in the village oscillated between curiosity and unease. When Raphael's daughter learned of the commotion, she made a public plea for people to respect the location. "My father and Luciana deserve dignity," she said. "This is not an attraction. It's the place where they may have spent their last moments." Her words, broadcast on TV and social media, touched a part of the community. But curiosity is hard to contain. Even children began playing treasure hunt in the dunes, imitating the scent tracking of Zico. And Zico, the dog who found the bag, now had the status of a local celebrity, receiving treats from tourists and posing for photos, unaware that he had unearthed more than just an object. He had brought to light a story that many would have preferred to keep buried. For Brandao, this meant time was once again running out. Each day, the original scene was further distorted by the presence of onlookers and the natural shifting of the sand. If there was another clue out there, it had to be found now. In early September 2014, less than a month after the discovery of the bag in the dunes, the investigation gained a new element, an old tourist map found in the collection of a local photographer. Dated 2002, the map showed little-known trails that connected the beach to small clearings inland, used by fishermen and locals as shortcuts to the main road. These paths, now partially overgrown, could have been ideal for transporting something or someone without being seen. Brando decided to walk these routes himself. He set out early, accompanied by 2 agents and a guide who knew every inch of the region. The hike revealed areas of difficult access, where the thick vegetation muffled the sound of the sea. At some points, the trail narrowed so much that 2 people couldn't walk side by side. There were also small clearings that could have served as a waiting point or a temporary hiding spot. This observation reinforced a hypothesis. The couple might have been ambushed far from the beach, in an area where screams wouldn't be heard and where small vehicles could approach via side trails. If that were true, the dunes might not have been the crime scene, but merely the place of concealment. Meanwhile, the forensic reports continued to arrive. A detailed examination of the chains and iron rings revealed they were repurposed parts, likely from small boats. The corrosion indicated years of exposure to the marine environment before being used to tie the bag. This suggested the perpetrator knew the area well and had access to nautical materials. Another detail: the bag itself was not common. The tarp had reinforced seams, typical of industrial packaging for transporting large volumes like grain or sand. Experts consulted said that at the time, some businesses and construction sites in the area received materials in such packaging. This lead, though broad, could help narrow the suspects to those with access to such material. Upon being informed of these discoveries, Raphael's daughter felt a mixture of frustration and hope. Everything points to someone who knew the beach and knew how to move around without being noticed, she questioned in a conversation with a journalist. So why is it so hard to find this person? In the village, old stories began to surface. A younger fisherman recounted hearing talk in the summer of 2003 about a couple taken by an outsider, but no one discussed it much, out of fear. Another resident, the owner of a small bar, claimed to have seen a tall man with a slow drawl asking about two people from Minas Gerais who were always together. She couldn't remember the exact date, only that it was during the summer of that year. Brandão noted everything, but he knew the risk of confusion was enormous. Memories blend, rumors gain traction, and suddenly an invented detail can be repeated so many times that it becomes truth in the eyes of some. The pressure from the press was mounting. Reporters insisted on knowing if there were any suspects. The detective responded with curt phrases, "The investigation is ongoing." But behind the scenes, he knew he needed something concrete before public attention dissipated. It was in this context that an unexpected contact was made. A former employee of a marina in Tamandaré called the station, saying that in January 2003, he had lent his small boat to a friend for a few hours. He never understood why the friend returned it with the tarp wet and covered in sand. He couldn't recall the man's full name, but he remembered the nickname, Gordo Naldo. He said the man disappeared from the area a few months later and no one ever heard from him again. This information prompted Brandão to cross-reference data with old police records. He found an Arnaldo Ferreira with a history of petty theft and temporary jobs along the coast. There was no direct link to the couple, but the coincidence of the nickname and the nautical work caught his attention. The search for Arnaldo began. It was hard to know if he still lived in the state. The last trace was a work registration from 2007 in a coastal city in Alagoas. Brandão sent out official requests and waited. Meanwhile, the discovery site remained under occasional surveillance. The low-lying vegetation was beginning to cover the excavated area again, as if the beach were once more trying to erase the mark of what had been found. Residents commented that at night the wind in the dunes sounded stronger, almost like a constant whistle. It was nothing supernatural, just the natural sound of moving sand. But for those who knew the story, it was impossible not to feel a chill. The investigation was advancing, but it was also stretching out, and with each passing week, Brandão felt the weight of a question he didn't want to face. What if, even with the bag, the crocs, the reports, and the leads, this story never had a name behind it? News about Gordo Naldo spread quickly among the village elders. Some said he had a habit of drinking late in the fishermen's bars. Others claimed he would disappear for days and reappear with money in his pocket, never explaining where it came from. No one, however, remembered seeing him after mid-2003. Some thought he had gone to work in marinas in other cities. Others believed he was dead. Brandão knew that leads like this, born from fragmented memories, could evaporate if not verified quickly. He ordered a full review of all small boat movements registered in the region that January. He wanted to cross-reference times, locations, and any name that might be connected to the marina mentioned by the former employee. Then a coincidence emerged. In one of the old files, there was a record of a wooden boat seized in 2004 on the coast of Alagoas without proper documentation. Among the items found on the vessel were 2 chains and a torn tarp bag, similar to those used for transporting cargo. The registered owner was Arnaldo Ferreira, although the case had been closed as improper use of a vessel. The seized material was too similar to the description of the bag found in the dunes to be ignored. Brandon requested access to the warehouse where the boat and objects were stored. Upon arrival, he found only fragments. The boat had already been dismantled and the chains were rusted to the point of breaking. Even so, he sent everything to forensics, hoping that some detail, a residue of sand, a fiber fragment, could establish a link. Raphael's daughter followed the updates from a distance. Each time a new lead emerged, the phone would ring in her home in Lavras. Her conversations with Brandão were always direct, but there were moments of heavy silence between them. If this man did it, he had 11 years to come forward, detective. 11 years, she said once. And that's precisely why we can't stop, Brando replied. Meanwhile, life in the village was split between the tourist bustle and the morbid curiosity about the case. Some business owners noted that despite the tragic subject, demand for lodging had increased. There were people who wanted to see the Disappearance beach. Others grew uneasy, complaining that the tragedy was turning into a spectacle. The exact spot where Zico had sniffed out the bag had changed. The barrier tape, frayed and torn, surrendered to the wind. The sand was already beginning to level the surface once more. Only those who knew the precise location could identify a faint depression in the terrain, now covered by small, creeping plants. In the investigation, a new forensic report brought details that unsettled Brandão. The blue fabric found with the bones showed linear cuts consistent with a sharp blade. It was impossible to determine if the cuts were made before or after death, but the analysis ruled out the possibility of simple wear and tear. This detail suggested the bag might have been meticulously prepared with pieces of fabric cut to fit. Another finding emerged. Inside the Crocs, there were small metallic particles, likely rust from the chains. This strengthened the theory that the shoes had been in close contact with the bag for a long time, not merely left beside it at the time of burial. A scenario began to form in Brandão's mind. A couple taken quietly to an isolated area, quickly restrained or neutralized, placed inside a bag reinforced with chains and buried in a location remote enough to delay any discovery. But the crucial question remained: why? Motive and opportunity were the missing keys. Until that moment, there was no sign of robbery. The couple's documents and money were found untouched in their room at the inn. If the crime was premeditated, it did not appear to be for immediate financial gain. The detective decided it was time to try and locate relatives or acquaintances of Gordo Naldo in Alagoas. He contacted coastal police departments, discreetly circulated the physical description, and waited. In cold cases, patience is as vital as action. Meanwhile, late one Friday afternoon, Brandão returned to the dunes. The sun descended slowly, painting the sand in hues of gold. Zico, who was there with his owner, Chico, ran to the detective, wagging his tail. It was impossible not to remember the day that dog, without understanding, had pulled at a thread that brought an 11-year-old secret to light. The sound of the wind in the dunes was the same, a constant, low, almost hypnotic hum. Brandão looked toward the horizon and considered what was left to do. If Gordo Naldo was indeed the missing piece, finding him could close the case. If not, the sand might once again cover everything. The phone rang early at the station. It was an investigator from Macchio reporting that a man identified as Arnaldo Ferreira had been detained for disorderly conduct after a fight in a fisherman's bar. Detective Brandão asked them to hold the man in custody and flew to the Alagoas coast the same day. Arnaldo was 54, with graying hair and a gaze that shifted between arrogance and exhaustion. His broad frame spoke of years of manual labor and poor diet. He denied any connection to the case at Praia dos Carneiros, but admitted to having worked as a temporary sailor on the Pernambuco coast many years ago. Regarding the nickname Gordo Naldo, he let out a brief smile. "That's just gossip from people with nothing better to do. I've had many nicknames." Brandon, without losing his calm tone, asked about the boat seized in 2004 and the wet tarp he had supposedly returned to a marina employee in 2003. Arnaldo replied that he didn't remember details, that boats and tarps were part of his daily life, and that the police were on a wild goose chase trying to link anything to a crime without proof. Still, he consented to providing a genetic sample. The detective knew a confession was unlikely, but a forensic exam could establish a link through particles, fibers, or residues found on the bag or chains. Back in Pernambuco, Brando closely followed the analysis of the material. While he waited for the results, he continued to flesh out the scenario of the disappearance. The investigation pointed to a swift, calculated act, an approach in an area with little foot traffic, the possible use of a boat for transport, and subsequent burial in a hard-to-reach location. If Arnaldo was involved, there was a chance he hadn't acted alone. Among the long-time residents interviewed, one name reappeared in more than one testimony: Edivaldo Bigua, a fisherman who often worked with Arnaldo on short trips out to sea. Described as quiet and suspicious, Bigua had left the region shortly after the couple's disappearance and was never seen again. This potential link reinforced the idea that the operation might have involved more than one person. In the village, the pressure was palpable. Business owners were torn between hoping the investigation would end quickly and fearing that solving the case would permanently tarnish the beach's image. Some believed an arrest would increase curiosity tourism. Others feared the opposite, that the association with a solved crime would drive families away. Meanwhile, Rafael's daughter was preparing for another trip to Pernambuco. She wanted to personally witness the next phase of the search in the dunes, scheduled for that month. Teams with metal detectors and sniffer dogs would be deployed to sweep areas near the spot where Zico found the bag, hoping to locate forgotten objects, remains, or tools. The day of the sweep dawned overcast. The team advanced in a slow, straight line when one of the dogs signaled a point of interest. Digging down about 20 centimeters, forensic experts found a piece of nautical rope with knots characteristic of those used to secure cargo on boats. The rope was stiff, hardened by salt, and partially buried. There had been enough time for thin roots to grow through its fibers. The discovery wasn't conclusive, but it strengthened the crime's nautical connection. The preliminary report indicated that the type of knot was common among experienced fishermen, and that the rope was consistent with materials found on small boats. Meanwhile, the lab finalized a crucial exam. On the chains that bound the bag, there were traces of light blue paint, similar to that used on artisanal wooden boats. A curious detail: the boat seized from Arnaldo in 2004 was painted that exact color. With these elements, Brando was assembling an increasingly coherent mosaic, but the centerpiece was still missing: direct evidence linking Arnaldo or any other suspect to the deaths of Luciana and Rafael. Without it, the case risked remaining open, even after its official reopening. At the end of an intense workday, Brandao returned to the dunes where he found his friend Chico sitting on a rock, looking out at the sea. Beside him, Zico dug distractedly as if searching for something invisible. The shopkeeper, without turning, said, "Detective, you know, the beach speaks to those who pay attention." Brandon didn't reply. He knew that in the silence between the wind and the sea, there were still questions that might never be answered. The wait for Arnaldo's genetic test results brought days of tension. Brandon knew that if there was any match between Arnaldo's material and particles found on the bag, chains, or rope, he would have a solid argument to move forward. In the meantime, he continued to sift through old records. A document caught his eye, a police report from 2003, filed with no connection to the disappearance, detailing a fight between Arnaldo and another man on the beach over an unpaid job. There were no further details, but the date, January 12th, 2 days after Luciana and Rafael vanished, aroused suspicion. In parallel, a new witness came forward. A retired fisherman who at the time lived in a nearby village said he had seen two men carrying something heavy wrapped in a tarp to the water's edge at dusk in a remote spot. He couldn't make out their faces due to the distance, but stated that one of them wore a wide-brimmed hat, recalling the description of the third man mentioned years earlier. These pieces began to fit into a narrative sketch. The couple had likely been approached, restrained, and transported by land or sea. The use of a tarp and chains indicated at least minimal planning, and the choice of the dunes as a hiding place suggested the perpetrators believed the area would remain untouched for many years. When Arnaldo's lab report finally arrived, it brought a breakthrough, but not the definitive proof. Microfibers consistent with the fabrics in the bag were found, along with particles of blue paint similar to that on the seized boat. However, there was no DNA from Arnaldo on the items. The defense could argue that such coincidences were common among fishermen. Even so, Brando decided to summon Arnaldo for another deposition. In the interrogation room, he presented photos of the chains, the rope, and the boat. Arnaldo maintained his defiant tone. "That's just junk, stuff everyone around here has used. You mean if you find a piece of rope on the ground, I get arrested?" The detective, his voice unchanged, simply replied, "It's not the rope. It's the story that comes with it." Meanwhile, Raphael's daughter participated in a symbolic act on the beach. With friends, relatives, and a few locals, they lit candles at sunset, standing in silence, looking out at the sea. It was the closest thing to a funeral the family had ever had. The wind extinguished some flames, but others held on, flickering until night fell. At the inn, room 13 was now permanently cleared. The owner's son decided he would no longer rent it out. He said that for him, that space now belonged to the couple's memory. Brando knew that without a confession or irrefutable technical proof, the case was at risk of ending with a likely suspect but not a convicted man. Still, every element gathered: the chains, the tarp, the rope, the paint, the testimonies, formed a web that was difficult to ignore. The problem was turning that web into something legally solid. The law is not satisfied with high probabilities. It demands certainty. Behind the scenes, some colleagues suggested the detective accept that a complete resolution might never come. But Brando wasn't built that way. For him, the only way to close a case was to name names and actions with clarity. He knew deep down that the family needed that more than any formality. In late October, while reviewing his notes, he received an unexpected call. A contact in Alagoas said that Edivaldo Biguá had recently been seen in a riverside community in the state's interior. The information was fragile, but it rekindled the possibility of finding someone who could confirm or deny Arnaldo's involvement. Brando didn't hesitate. He knew this might be the last chance to push the case out from the shadows of the dunes. The journey to the riverside community was long. Brando and two agents crossed dirt roads, makeshift bridges, and stretches by motorboat. When they arrived, they found a village of simple stilt houses where the river met the sea. Asking for Edivaldo Biguá was met with cautious stares. Some said he had moved away. Others insisted he still lived there, fishing quietly. On the third day of their search, they found him sitting in the bow of a canoe, mending nets. He was a thin man, his skin weathered by the sun, his hands scarred by work. Brando introduced himself, explained the reason for his visit, and asked to talk. Bigua hesitated but eventually agreed. The conversation began with evasions. Bigua claimed he didn't remember details, that it was too long ago and that he didn't want to get involved in anyone else's trouble. When Brando mentioned Arnaldo, however, his expression changed. "I didn't see anything, but I heard things," he said in a low voice. When asked what he had heard, he recounted that in 2003, after a night of drinking, Arnaldo had commented that 2 tourists disappeared because they looked the wrong way. He didn't explain further, just laughed to himself, as if it were an inside joke. Bigua said he didn't think much of it at the time, but after he heard about the couple's disappearance, he began to wonder. Unfortunately, this was not proof, merely an indication. Still, it strengthened Arnaldo's connection to the event. Back in Pernambuco, Brandão compiled all the material. The conclusion of the official inquiry pointed to Arnaldo Ferreira as the prime suspect, possibly acting with another unidentified person. The exact motive was never clarified. It could have been a trivial conflict, a violent impulse, or something more planned. Without direct technical evidence, the case would not go to trial. It would be archived again, but with a narrative far closer to the truth than the one from 2004. Rafael's daughter received the news with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. In November 2014, the families organized a simple ceremony on the shores of Praia dos Carneiros. Candles were lit in the sand, and a wreath of flowers was cast into the sea. The wind blew steadily, and the sound of the waves seemed to carry a graver tone. Seu Chico, present with Zico at his side, watched in silence. The dog, not understanding the solemnity, just sat staring intently at the horizon. After that day, the dunes returned to their natural cycle. The creeping vegetation covered the excavation site, and the wind erased the tracks. For those who didn't know the story, it was just another beautiful, silent stretch of beach. But for those who remembered, every grain of sand carried the memory of an interrupted summer. Brando, closing the report, wrote on the final page, "Cases like this rarely reach a true end. Sometimes all we can do is reduce the size of the shadows. But as long as there is someone to remember, the disappearance will never be complete." The case of Praia dos Carneiros remains officially unsolved. But for the families, the discovery in 2014 was the only possible final chapter. An imperfect yet inevitable end. If you followed this story this far, you understand how vital it is to give a voice to the real cases that remain unsolved. Please subscribe to the channel, share this video, and send it to someone who also needs to hear the story of Luciana and Rafael. In this way, more people can remember, more people can question, and perhaps they can help write the endings that are still missing.